Today, the Spokane Police Department announced it has identified the man who killed 9-year-old Candy Rogers in 1959.
It was possibly the most well-known cold case in the city and the entire state.
A 9-year-old girl selling mints door-to-door in 1959 was abducted, raped, and strangled by a neighbor who lived 1 mile away. A man who helped search for her sat beside grieving family and died free. 62 years later, a sealed glass jar cracked the case wide open. He showed up to help find her. He walked the same streets as the detectives, the neighbors, the grieving family. He looked through the same trees, called her name into the same cold air. He already knew exactly where she was. She was 9 years old, 4 feet 4, 60 pounds, the smallest girl on the street. It was a Friday afternoon in March 1959, and Candy Rogers had a plan. 7 boxes of campfire mints. A sales badge she was determined to earn. A week of free summer camp if she could sell enough. She had spent the half hour before the official start time sitting with her grandmother, eating an oatmeal cookie, talking through which neighbors would definitely buy and which ones she'd have to convince. At exactly 4 o'clock, she stepped outside. She never came back. What happened to Candy Rogers between that front door and the darkness that fell over Spokane that night would stay hidden for 62 years. The man responsible walked free his entire life. He was never a suspect, never a person of interest, never once mentioned in any police report. He was buried in the same cemetery as the child he murdered. For over 50 years, nobody knew. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what existed before it was gone. Spokane, Washington in 1959 was a different world. West Central Spokane was a working-class neighborhood built on familiarity. Modest homes, people who knew each other's names, streets where children moved freely because everyone on the block was watching, even when they weren't. Nobody locked their doors. Nobody watched the clock when kids went outside. There was no reason to. Candy Rogers lived on the 2000 block of West Mission Avenue, in an apartment above a neighborhood grocery store. Her mother, Elaine, taught high school history and PE. Her grandparents lived right next door. She had a dog named Shep. She was small for her age and quiet by nature, but she had found her place. She was a bluebird, the junior level of the Campfire Girls of America, and that membership meant something to her. The badges, the goals, the structure. She had an older campfire sister assigned to her, a 10-year-old girl from her neighborhood who was supposed to look out for her. March 6, 1959 was the first day of the mint-selling season. Candy got out of school at 3:15 and was at her troop leader's house by 3:30, picking up her boxes. 7 was the maximum she could carry at her size. She came home and sat with her grandmother until 4 o'clock, the official start time, running through her plan out loud. Which houses first? Who would definitely buy? How many boxes she needed to move to earn that badge? She was not anxious. She was excited. At 4 o'clock, she walked out into the cold March air with 7 boxes of mints under her arm and started knocking on doors. In early March in the Pacific Northwest, darkness falls without warning. By 5:30 that evening, the streetlights were flickering on. Candy knew the rule. Be home before the lights. When 5:30 came and went with no sign of her, her grandfather stepped outside. He walked the block. He checked with neighbors. He asked if anyone had seen her. Nobody had, not recently. When her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment to find the apartment empty, the quiet shifted into something heavier. Within the hour, family members were out on the streets. By nightfall, police had been called. The problem was that Candy was not the only campfire girl out that evening. Dozens of little girls in identical uniforms were carrying identical boxes through the same neighborhood at the same time. Witnesses thought they had spotted her, but couldn't confirm which child they had actually seen. Her exact path could not be traced. Then, around 9 o'clock that night, searchers found something on Pettit Drive, a road that winds up a hill locals call Doomsday Hill. Mint boxes, scattered across the ground. Not dropped accidentally, scattered. The pattern suggested they had been thrown from a moving vehicle. Some had landed in the road. Others had tumbled into the grass. The trail pointed south, across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood. One of those boxes had a partial fingerprint on it. It was lifted, preserved, and sent to the FBI. It was never identified. By 9 o'clock on the evening of March 6, 1959, everyone in Spokane understood one thing with terrible clarity. Candy Rogers had not gotten lost. Someone had taken her. By the morning of March 7th, over 1,200 people had shown up to find one little girl. Marines, Boy Scouts, mail carriers, utility workers, men on horseback. They converged on west central Spokane before sunrise and fanned out across every road, every hill, every tree line they could reach. A command post was established at the intersection near where the mint boxes had been found. The U.S. Air Force dispatched helicopters for aerial coverage. They had no GPS, no cell phones, no surveillance cameras. They had scattered boxes, one unidentified fingerprint, and a trail that ended at the edge of a bridge. On March 7th, just one day into the search, a U.S. Air Force helicopter flying low over the search area struck high-tension power lines and crashed into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed: Airman Merles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 2 others survived. 3 men died searching for Candy Rogers. The city was grieving in 2 directions simultaneously, and she still had not been found. Tips poured in from across the country. Hundreds, then thousands. Detectives followed every one. In 1959, there was no sex offender registry. Investigators identified several individuals with relevant criminal histories and worked through each of them. None could be connected to Candy through evidence. The days dragged into silence. 16 days after she disappeared, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting in a stretch of woods off Old Trails Road, roughly 7 miles from Candy's home. Moving through the trees near an abandoned rock quarry, they found a pair of small girls' shoes placed near a tree trunk. Not thrown, not dropped, placed. They returned to base and reported it. The following morning, a search party moved into those woods at daybreak. Within minutes, a searcher pushed aside a mound of brush and pine needles. Candy Rogers was underneath. She had been buried under a cover of branches and dead tree boughs approximately 50 yards off the road. Retired Spokane Police Captain Richard Obering was among the officers who found her that morning. He would carry that scene in his memory for the rest of his life, and he would still be alive 62 years later when the man responsible was finally named. The cause of death was strangulation. The ligature used was a strip torn from her own slip, the garment she had been wearing when she left home. Her ankles had been bound with another strip cut from the same clothing. There was a mark around her waist consistent with rope restraint, though no rope was found at the scene. Medical examiners documented evidence of sexual assault. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and stored. The investigators of 1959 had no framework for genetic evidence, no concept of what forensic science might one day be capable of extracting from biological material. But they preserved everything they had. They couldn't have known how much that decision would matter. For almost 40 years, Spokane investigators believed they had the right answer. They had a name, a history, a detail that felt like it connected everything. And they were completely wrong. His name was Hugh Byron Morse. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club. 4 years before Candy's murder, he had been arrested in California for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. A chilling parallel to what happened on West Mission Avenue. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse attacked and murdered 2 women in Spokane. He then moved across the country, committing at least 7 more violent crimes before being caught in Minnesota in 1961, after a neighbor recognized him from an FBI wanted poster. He died in a Minnesota prison in April 2003. The profile was hard to dismiss. He preyed on young girls selling things door to door. He was in Spokane. He had a pattern. And then there was the grape gum. Across multiple Morse crime scenes, investigators had found grape-flavored gum, consistent enough that it became a documented behavioral marker, something detectives used to link his crimes together. During Candy's autopsy in 1959, a detective noted a purplish stain on her clothing. It had what the report described as a grape-like smell. For years, that detail meant nothing on its own. But once Morse's profile came into focus, that stain became the anchor point of the entire theory. It was never tested, never chemically analyzed. It was an observation made in a morgue in 1959 that hardened, over decades of repetition, into near certainty. It pointed an entire generation of investigators toward a dead man who had nothing to do with it. Then came 2001. Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's preserved clothing to a forensic lab. Scientists found a semen sample in the evidence and built a complete DNA profile, the first concrete biological lead in 42 years of investigation. They tested it against Hugh Morse. No match. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the national DNA database. The system returned silence. Whoever had left that DNA had never been arrested for a crime requiring a sample to be collected. He had never surfaced in any database, any tip line, any report. In 62 years of active investigation, his name had not appeared once. But investigators didn't know yet that he had been right there the entire time. Living in the same city, moving through the same streets, dying in the same ground where Candy was buried. There is one reason this case was ever solved. Not the DNA lab in Texas. Not the genealogy database. Not the detectives. All of those things were essential, but none of them could have worked without a single decision made by an unknown investigator in Spokane in the spring of 1959. Someone put Candy's underwear in a glass mason jar and sealed it shut. That is it. That is the entire reason this case exists today as a solved case and not an open file. Glass does not degrade. It does not absorb moisture. It does not react with what is stored inside it. That airtight seal, created in an era that had no reason to think about genetic preservation, built a near-perfect environment for biological evidence to survive across 6 decades. When forensic scientists finally opened that jar in the early 2000s, the DNA was not just detectable. It was strong enough to construct a complete genetic profile. The 1959 investigator who made that decision could not have known what they were protecting or why it would matter. They just sealed the jar and put it on a shelf. For years, that jar sat in an evidence locker while cases opened and closed around it, while technology slowly advanced toward the point where it could finally tell the truth about what was inside. When that moment came, the jar was ready. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her parents told her about Candy Rogers the way Spokane parents had been telling their children about Candy Rogers for decades. Not as history, not as news, but as a warning. Watch where you go. Be careful. Remember what happened to that little girl. The case was embedded in how the city raised its children long after the crime itself had faded from the headlines. Wright grew up to become a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. In 2018, when the Spokane Police Department began systematically reviewing its cold case files, Candy's folder landed on her desk. The timing was not coincidental. That same year, California investigators publicly announced the identification of the Golden State Killer through a technique called forensic genetic genealogy, running crime scene DNA through consumer ancestry databases to locate distant relatives of an unknown suspect, then building family trees outward until the field narrowed to a single name. The moment that arrest made international news, cold case units across the country pulled out their oldest unsolved files and asked the same question. Could this work for us? Wright submitted what remained of the DNA sample to a private genealogy laboratory in 2020. The lab examined what it received, assessed the degradation and contamination levels accumulated over 60 years, and sent it back. Too compromised. They declined the case. That rejection came very close to being the end. CODIS had returned nothing. Every conventional investigative path had been exhausted. If genealogical DNA analysis could not be performed with this sample, there was nowhere left to go. Then Wright heard about a laboratory in Fort Worth, Texas called Othram. Othram specializes in exactly the cases other labs decline. They developed a proprietary process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, built specifically for samples that are degraded, contaminated, or near depleted. In February 2021, Wright described the evidence to them. They said they could try. She packaged up what remained, by her own description, the very last drops of viable material, and sent it to Texas. Othram returned a genealogical profile. Running it through an ancestry database, analysts identified 3 brothers. All deceased. All from Spokane. John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. Genealogy cannot distinguish between brothers at that level of analysis. Their genetic signatures look nearly identical from a family tree perspective. To identify which of the three men had left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed a living descendant. Only one of the brothers had children. Kathy Hoff received a call from a Spokane cold case detective. He asked for her help. He identified himself. He gave her almost nothing else. He said he'd like her to come in. She didn't wait. In the 45 minutes between that call and her arrival at Spokane Police Headquarters, Kathy went online. She searched. Somewhere in that drive across the city, she found the story. A 9-year-old girl, March 1959, Campfire Mints, a neighborhood 1 mile from where her father had lived. She walked into that police station already carrying the weight of what she suspected. She volunteered her DNA without hesitation. The results came back on September 8, 2021. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to have come from a biological relative of Kathy Hoff than from any random person in the general population. Her father had been there. Her father had left that evidence. Her father was the man investigators had never once looked for in 62 years of searching. Investigators were not finished. John Hoff was dead. There would be no arrest, no trial, no cross-examination. That meant the burden of certainty rested entirely with the science itself. They obtained a warrant and exhumed John Ray Hoff's body on September 23, 2021. The final result came back October 1st. The probability that the DNA from Candy's clothing belonged to John Ray Hoff rather than an unrelated individual was 25 quintillion to 1. 25 followed by 18 zeros. That number does not leave room for doubt. John Ray Hoff was born on August 11, 1938, in Spokane. He grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. Not a drifter, not a stranger, but a local man raised in the same city as the child he would murder. In 1955, at 16 years old, he escaped from a juvenile reform facility near Olympia and was caught near Yakima. That record pushed him toward the military. He joined the U.S. Army at 17 and was assigned to Nike missile sites protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, in Spokane, his own hometown. On March 6, 1959, he was 20 years old. He lived at 221 West Broadway Avenue. Candy Rogers lived on the 2200 block of West Mission Avenue, 1 mile apart. But investigators didn't know any of this. In 62 years, his name had never appeared. Not in a tip. Not in a report, not in a single passing reference. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane. The charge was second-degree assault. What he had done. He grabbed a woman, forcibly removed her clothing, used those same garments to bind her, then attempted to strangle her before fleeing. She survived only because something interrupted him. Read that carefully. He used his victim's own clothing to restrain her. He used her own clothing to strangle her. That is an exact match to what was done to Candy Rogers. The ligature around Candy's neck was torn from her own slip. Her ankles were bound with another strip of the same garment. The 1961 victim survived. Candy did not. Hoff served 6 months. The Army declared him a deserter and dishonorably discharged him. He drifted door-to-door cutlery sales, a lumber yard, a meat packing plant where he suffered a chemical burn on his face. He was not building a life toward anything. And then there is the detail that makes the room go quiet. Hoff had a stepsister. She was 10 years old in 1959. She was a campfire girl. She was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the program. She knew Candy. She cared about her. When Candy disappeared and Spokane collapsed into grief and searching and funerals for Air Force crew members who died looking for her, this girl was devastated. She sat beside her brother, beside John Hoff, and cried. She told him how terrible it was. She told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. He sat there. He listened. He said nothing. She spent her entire life carrying that grief as an innocent bystander, never knowing that the person who had caused it was sitting right beside her, absorbing her tears without a word. When Detective Stormant tracked her down after the case was solved and told her what her brother had done, she was, in his words, absolutely heartbroken. John Ray Hoff died in 1970. He shot himself. The date he chose was his daughter's birthday, the day she turned 9 years old, the same age as Candy Rogers when he murdered her. Whether that timing carried guilt or something darker, he took that answer with him. When investigators went to confirm where Hoff had been buried, they discovered something nobody in that room had been prepared for. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been interred in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The little girl he abducted, the child he strangled with her own clothing. She was there, and so was he, yards apart, for over 5 decades. While her family visited her grave and stood in that silence and wondered, he was in the same ground. When Kathy Hoff learned that detail, she made a decision without being asked. She arranged to have her father's remains relocated to a different cemetery. Detective Stormant described the reason simply, so that Candy could have some peace. When Candy's family heard about that gesture, her cousin Joanne was overcome. It was not justice. Nothing about this outcome was justice in the conventional sense. There was no trial, no sentencing, no moment where the law looked John Hoff in the face and named him for what he was. He had already made sure of that. But it was the only thing the Hoff family had the power to give. At the press conference on November 19, 2021, Kathy Hoff's videotape statement was played for the room. "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly. I hope that it gives her peace knowing that even though it's not really justice because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved. That statement is worth sitting with. His name has this on it now. That is not justice, but it is not nothing either. It is a record corrected, a truth placed permanently in the public account, an acknowledgement that no passage of time and no convenient death can erase." Retired Captain Richard Obering sat in the audience at that press conference. He was one of the officers who had found Candy's body in those woods on March 22, 1959. He had pushed aside that pile of branches. He had seen what John Hoff left behind. He had carried it for 62 years. He was still alive to hear the answer. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormant, visibly emotional throughout, was asked how many hours had been invested in the Candy Rogers investigation over 6 decades. He didn't give a number. "This isn't measured in hours," he said. "This is measured in careers. 3 generations of detectives. 3 generations of handing a case forward with the same unspoken request. Don't give up on her. The last generation didn't. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She had a dog named Shep. She had a grandmother who made her oatmeal cookies. She had a badge she was working toward and a whole street of neighbors she was excited to visit. She had a future that belonged to her by right. She was killed on a cold Friday afternoon by a 20-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away, who helped search for her, who listened to her campfire sister weep, and who spent his entire life without consequence. It took 62 years, 3 generations of detectives, a forensic scientist who grew up hearing Candy's name as a warning, 1 final sample sent to 1 final lab, and a glass mason jar sealed shut in 1959 by someone whose name we will never know, to finally tell the truth about what happened. 62 years, 8 months, 13 days. The clock has stopped. But here is the question that does not let go. John Hoff committed an almost identical attack in 1961 and walked out of a courthouse after 6 months. If that sentence had reflected the true danger he posed, if the system had seen him clearly in that moment, would we even know the name Candy Rogers today?